Okay, I'm going to go ahead and begin and introduce Mel. It is my sincere pleasure today to introduce Mel Bochner for our live program for Magazzino da Casa, Magazzino Italian Art's virtual programming in association with the exhibition he has curated with Magazzino, Bochner, Boetti, Fontana, which opened in the fall of last year and will continue through April 5th of this spring. This is, of course, the first time that Magazzino, a museum dedicated to post-war through contemporary Italian art in Cold Spring, New York, founded by Nancy Olnick and Giorgio Spanu, have exhibited a non-Italian artist's work. So it's a very special moment for Magazzino as well. It's also a huge monumental show with regard to your own exhibition history. Mel, this is the first exhibition you've curated since your now canonical 1966 exhibition at the School of Visual Arts. We'll talk a little bit about that today as well. We're also here to celebrate, of course, the launch of Mel's new artist book, Language is Not Transparent, Babble, which has been published by Noireditore in association with the artist exhibition at the Gallery Noir in Turin in northwestern Italy. And it's sort of fitting, as I mentioned before the introduction, that this book was published by a gallery in Turin, where some of Mel's first shows in Italy were held at the Galleria Sperone in 1970. When we're thinking about the themes of the book then today, we can also think about how Mel's exploration of systems and language in many, many forms, including measurement, has been a through line through his ever-changing and prolific practice. Mel Bochner is an artist who really needs no introduction, but I will mention a few points here and then give a few remarks with regard to the topic of our conversation today, which is focused on what, Mel, you have spoken about as your Italian days, right? The years and time you've spent periodically since the early 1970s in Italy, but also your encounter with Italian art stemming to the early 60s, as early as the 1960 Carnegie International, seeing Lucio Fontana's work for the first time. And so thinking about kind of your encounters with Italy prior to your time in Italy, which was really formative to so much of your early career, and which this show really highlights so well. As I mentioned, Mel Bochner has a BFA in 1962 from the School of Fine Arts at Carnegie Mellon, and he also has an honorary doctorate of fine arts from Carnegie Mellon issued to him in 2005. He's had innumerable exhibitions on a national and international scale, including his retrospective at the Jewish Museum in 2014, a recent installation of Measure Room No Vantage Point at Dia Beacon in 2019, and shows concurrently at Noir Gallery in Turin, as well as at, of course, Magazzino Italian Art. And this is the first exhibition that explores your practice, Mel, in relationship to these two key figures of Boetti, Alighiero Boetti, associated with Arte Povera, and Lucio Fontana. I'll just say a brief word about who I am and why I'm here. I'm Tenley Bick. I'm assistant professor of global contemporary art at Florida State University in Tallahassee, where I'm joining you from today. But I also last year had the distinct pleasure of being Magazzino's scholar in residence for the 2019-2020 year. And it was during this time, as the show was developing, that I became really interested in some of the international and global resonances of Italian art, especially Arte Povera, and learned so much about transatlanticism during this period as we were thinking more about Mel's work and Mel, what you've discussed with us in preparation for the show. I should mention that this is a really special exhibition then for Magazzino specifically. This is an institution, as I said, dedicated to post-war and contemporary art, but also is an institution that was founded by an American, Nancy Olnick from New York, and Giorgio Spanu, an Italian from Sardinia. And so there's a really wonderful exploration of transatlanticism in the exhibition that I think also relates to this institution specifically. So I'm hoping we can hear a little bit about that from you, Mel. So to get started, Mel, I wanted to begin with thinking about the kind of undertaking of doing an exhibition in 2020 amidst a pandemic, amidst everything that's gone on in the world, and to return to doing a curatorial project. This, of course, is an image of your working drawings and other visible things on paper, not necessarily meant to be viewed as art, from December of 1966. And the installation can be done in an empty gallery on 4 sculpture stands, but included Xerox copies of studio notes, plans, schemes, receipts, etc., that were collected and Xeroxed by you, including many, many drawings from other artists. So I'm wondering if you can think about, or help us think about, kind of why returning to doing a curatorial project now, and why for Magazzino?
I don't think I ever set out to do a curatorial project then or now. I was a very young art history instructor at the school, visual arts. They had an opening in their schedule. The director of the gallery asked me if I could put together an exhibition of drawings for the over Christmas period. So I was very interested in the idea then at the time, and maybe still, what I called the upstream. What's upstream of a work of art? What's behind it? What are the initial thoughts? And this concept of the working drawings came to mind. So I called or invited or wrote to a number of people, some of whom I knew, some I didn't know, if they would be interested in this. Practically everybody said yes. I asked them to choose 5 drawings. I went around, picked them up, took them back, showed them to the director of the gallery, and her response was, "What the hell is this?" She said, "I thought you were going to bring drawings." "Well, these are drawings." She didn't like it, let's put it that way. And she said she was not going to pay to frame them.
Okay.
So I said, well, okay. And I had been using photography in my work at that point. So I thought, well, let's just have them photographed and pin them to the wall. And she said, "I'm not going to pay to photograph all these." So fortunately, the school had just invested in a Xerox copier, which was the advanced technology of the day. And as an art history instructor, I had complete use of that machine. So I thought, what the hell, I'll just photocopy all the drawings and then pin them to the wall. To make a long story short, as the drawings started coming out of the machine and stacking up all the same size and all the same color, it began to resemble a book. And at the time, someone who was very important, maybe not so important anymore, was Marshall McLuhan, who had that the photocopier, the Xerox machine, makes every person a publisher. So, well, that's an interesting idea. I'll just make more than one copy and put them in a book. So
it's interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned McLuhan. I mean, beyond the every person can be a publisher sort of idea. Of course, at this time, he's writing about the potential for the new electric and electronic age to be a global village. And it could have gone sort of 2 ways for McLuhan. It could have been sort of an ending of sorts of society as we had known it, or it could be a kind of platform for connections and for being closer together than ever. And I wonder if maybe that's a way for us to kind of have an entry point to thinking about the impact of these 2 artists on your early work, and to get to some of what you have discussed as sort of the odd resonances between what you saw happening in your own practice and in certain conceptual trajectories in the United States versus what's happening in Europe at that moment, especially in Italy with process art and arte povera, and on behalf of Fontana, this connection also to South American avant-gardes. Two works from the show we have in front of us here, one of which reminds us of your first encounter with Fontana. How are you thinking about sort of getting to the global within this, or to the odd resonances that we can think about in this transatlantic connection that you're really highlighting in your work and in your writing on your Italian days?
Well, one thing is, in 1966, I'd never heard of any of these artists. It wasn't until 1968, or was it early 69, when the exhibition Attitude Becomes Form happened, and the catalog made it to America, and I saw all of these artists who were working in ways that were similar to what certain American artists were doing. People like Nauman, Eva Hess, Barry LeVay, myself, etc., where the idea was the process and not the finished product, basically. The use of mediums like photography, and I don't know if any Italian artists were using photocopying at that time. But the American art world was not receptive to the work of the artists I'm talking about. It was still the high point of minimalism and formalism. But the Attitude Becomes Form catalog sort of opened a curtain on a future, and then one began to see that one wasn't necessarily all alone. That's an
interesting idea, though, that a catalog, right? Because the catalog in many of these exhibitions became sort of exhibitions in and of themselves. It's an interesting connection to also thinking about some of the ways that you would use catalogs in your shows in Italy to think about kind of opening up other spaces. I wonder if we can come back to this work, but just to sort of highlight where you were in this sort of formative moment for our viewers, 66, this important year for art historians, where you, Mel, do this show that's now regarded as one of the first exhibitions of or examples of conceptual art, and would be a hugely important show for artists that came after you. You wrote this amazing review in 1966 of the Primary Structures show for Arts Magazine. And partway through the essay, you're speaking about sort of the challenges of what you call the new art. And you're noting that, they said that their work is dumb in the sense that it does not speak to you, yet subversive in that it points to the probable end of all Renaissance values. And so thinking about the Renaissance and thinking about Italy at this moment, you would also experiment with Italian ideas in other ways during 66 that to me seem to sort of precede what becomes an amazing future for you in Italy, speaking about opening up that curtain. Can you tell us a little bit about these works?
Well, I guess, the beginnings at that time of my work are certainly involved with minimalism, with the work of Judd, LeWitt, Flavin, but trying to find ways around the so-called obviousness of form in minimalism. And I was very interested in numbers and words, because at a certain point, one is always trying to differentiate themselves from what other people are doing.
Yeah.
You don't want to do the same thing, yet at the same time, you realize that certain work marks a boundary. And to get over that boundary, you have to understand where that boundary is. So trying to find things that I thought belonged to me and not to anybody else was rather difficult because, you know, whenever you start out, it looks like everything's already been done.
Right.
So the two things that I could think of that belonged to everyone and hence belonged to no one were words and numbers. And then how to utilize these things. Well, in the sculpture, three-way Fibonacci, it was using Fibonacci progressions to determine the size of the volumes and the spacing between them in terms of a progression. Now we know that Mario Merz used Fibonacci. It was, I don't know when he started using it. He wasn't aware of my work. I wasn't aware of his work. And he used it, I would say, more like a found object. He didn't interpret it, he presented it. In my work, I used it in this piece as a generator of forms. So if you don't know it's the Fibonacci progression, what difference does it make? So that was one way of using numbers to generate volumes and forms and intervals, spaces, etc. In the minimal art, the movie, that's a totally different story.
We don't have to get into it. I just think it's interesting that some of the ways that you were thinking about the sort of cast of characters in minimalism, artists, dealers, significant others, was in part through Italian movie stars. And thinking about New York also as a sort of city that has a close connection to Italian American history as well. You can see Frank Sinatra on here, for example. And so I think there's this kind of interesting way that between those early ideas that you're having around practice and activities and thinking about words and numbers as things that everybody shares and no one owns, you then have this experience at the Metropolitan Museum where you see some of the work of artists associated with the Trecento in Italy, and later visit this chapel by Giotto. Why was that an important experience for you, visiting that show at the Met?
Well, I had never had any personal experience of Italian art other than, you know, slides in an art history class. And so that show, they actually had peeled these frescoes off the wall and hung them on the wall at the Met. And so seeing work at that scale was very surprising because they were bigger than Pollock and they were bigger than Newman and they were bigger than Clifford Still. So that was a surprise because, you know, we all thought, well, Newman, Still, and Rothko, Pollock had invented this thing of big painting, but no, it had occurred before. They were painted directly on the wall, and it just put a little bug in my mind. Why not do something directly on the wall as a way around, you know, what I was very much thinking about not doing was painting on canvas.
So maybe that's when we come back to your work for Virginia Dwan's language show, where you first made this work and have since departed to incorporate the Italian into it.
Well, there was this annual exhibition at Dwan Gallery called, I can't remember, like Printed Matter or Matter Printed or something like that. this was I think the final one was in 1970. And this piece is done in the context of conceptual art at that moment. It's my rejoinder to a group of artists who believed that if you typed some words on a sheet of paper, it was a more direct avenue to the viewer's experience or beliefs.
Mm.
But I thought that was rather naive, because language is not transparent. It's has a lot of agendas. Everything has something behind it. Everything has an interpretation. And so I did this work on the wall at Dwan Gallery to make that point. And I also wanted to think in a new way about painting. The bottom of this rectangle is always left open and ragged and dripping, to indicate that language is never fixed. Language is never ending.
Well, and shortly thereafter, I mean, around this moment, you've made your measurement works, and you sort of thought about the issue of translation and measurement between the imperial system and the metric system. And then you're making word drawings as well, where you're overlapping language or text from different languages, as you see here. So I wonder if you say language is not fixed, it's not transparent, there are agendas. How does translation for you play into that? And certainly there's an experimentation here with legibility, right? That sort of speaks to the difficulty of translation. But I'd love to hear how translation figures into your thought process, specifically between Italian and English, and perhaps because of the history of painting and the importance of Italian history to that.
Well, I think all that is correct. In the early 70s, I was seeing my work shown in France and Italy and Germany, and traveling to those places. It was the first times I was ever stranded without a language. And I became aware. I remember when I was having my first show with Heiner Friedrich, there was a big dinner and everyone was talking in German, which was, their language. And I'm just sitting there and wondering, what are they talking about? So I asked someone, what are you guys talking about? And he said art. And then they went back to German.
Oh dear.
So one sees that translation is basically at the root of everything. Everything is a translation. Nietzsche said that everything is an interpretation. I think everything is a translation.
So maybe we can segue from that point to thinking about translation as maybe one activity. In your work, you've spoken before about the importance of activities and human interventions with material, to sort of distinguish your practice as not aligning with an idea of conceptual art that focuses solely on the ideational, but focuses really on objects and materials and human interventions with them. This work in particular has had a number of lives, never the same, but it began with your early pebble works in the early 70s, one example of what you see at right, when you're displacing the idea of a consolidated form, either modeled or carved or welded, conventions of sculpture. Here we just have pebbles on the floor. And after a visit to this place, the so-called Temple of Pythagoras, you have this amazing story about seeing this place in Metaponto in Italy while you are working with the Bonomo Gallery. Can you tell us a little bit about this work, its versions in hazelnuts, your visit to the Temple of Pythagoras, and how you arrive at the version of it in this show where you've engaged pieces of Murano glass left in Lucio Fontana's studio that you were given access to for a show in the early 90s?
Well, I was invited to do a show in Bari, Italy, with Marilena Bonomo, who was opening her gallery. I was to have the first exhibition. And I spent about 3 weeks there, and we took a lot of nice trips around the beautiful countryside. And one of the things they said, oh, let's go see the Temple of Pythagoras. And we went to see the Temple of Pythagoras, which isn't much of a temple, or what's left of it. And I knew a little bit about who Pythagoras was. And while we were there, it was a very moving place. In the middle of a big field, it was just there. No signs, no tourists, nothing. And I thought, well, it would be nice to leave a little souvenir for Pythagoras. So I picked up a bunch of stones on the site and just laid them out in the shape of the theorem of Pythagoras. And then we left. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to do for the show at Bonomo, I thought, well, that would be a nice thing to do. That would be an interesting thing. And I found some stones, and I was on my way to the gallery to do it. And there was a guy standing outside the gallery selling roasted hazelnuts. And so I bought a couple of bags, and I thought, well, this is really the essence of anti-materialist sculpture. So what difference does it make what I count? I can count stones, or I can count hazelnuts, or I can count almost anything. It's the configuration and the idea that is really important. And when the show is over, you just gather up the hazelnuts and you can eat them, or you can throw them.
Yeah, I think that gets a lot to this point, though, that, you know, while the sculptures themselves in this case might be ephemeral, right? It's still about sculpture as connected to idea. And I wonder then if you could tell us how you go from stones to this incredible work that's on display at Magazzino in the show, the meditation on the theorem of Pythagoras done in Fontana's Murano glass.
Well, I had always wanted to go beyond monochromatic materials. All the stones are the same color, all the nuts are the same color, and I'd done some versions of it using stones and nuts and other things, but I couldn't think of any way to bring color into it. I wanted to get back to some of the color in my early cardboard sculptures. Because painting a stone is a really dumb idea. So that wasn't going to work. Anyway, I was invited to do a show in Milan at Casoli Gallery, which just happened to be in the former studio of Lucio Fontana. Amazing. And when I saw the place, the ceiling was very low. It was in a basement. It just seemed impossible. And I said, I don't think I can do anything here. And then the gallerist said, well, while you're here, do you want to see what's in the back room? Okay. In the back room, he said, we have all of Fontana's old brushes and paint, sort of like, you know, the relics of the saint in a church.
Wow.
I guess it was like a church, actually. And then there was a big wooden box. And I said, what's in the box? And he said, oh, that's the glass, the Murano glass that Fontana used to break up and glue to the surface of his paintings. Can I see it? Yeah, sure. So we opened the box, we look at it, and as I've said a number of times before, it was like the opening of Ali Baba's cave. It was just spectacular, the light coming out of this box of Murano glass, red, yellow, blue, green. And so I said, Sergio, give me the glass and I'll give you a show. And he said, okay. And he did, and I did the show. And I left, and that was that until about 20 years later, Mark Selwyn, who's a dealer in California, wanted to redo that show. And I said, well, we can't because I don't have the glass. So we finally found a way of getting in touch with Sergio Capitale. And like 3 months later, a big box arrives in my studio. And inside it is all of the glass, each piece wrapped in a piece of newspaper, Corriere della Sera of 1991. And
Amazing.
I got the glass back.
Amazing. Speaking of newspaper and speaking of exchanges and your time in Italian galleries, I'll just highlight this view, this incredible view, thinking about counting and thinking about Fontana and color and Fontana's works. You can see this beautiful installation at Magazzino. This part of the show in particular is quite striking. I want to move forward and talk to you a little bit about some of your experiments. Perhaps we should start with the Toselli. This is a work you did, a theory of painting work you did at Franco Toselli's gallery in Milan in 1970. And this was one of your first shows in Italy, you know, where you were really received, as you said, you know, quite warmly, and your practice and experimentation was really embraced there. You also participated in Germano Celan's conceptual art di Povera land art show in Turin that year. But at Toselli, we see this incredible work where we have all these Italian newspapers on the floor, just local newspapers, and different iterations of painting and different geometric structures along with the words disperse, cohere on the wall. Can you tell us a little bit about making this work at Toselli?
Yeah, I had done some experiments before I went to Italy. It never really gelled in my mind what it was I was trying to do. There's a famous photograph of Matisse in his studio late in life, sketching the murals for his chapel. And on the floor, I guess to keep the floor clean, he had laid out newspapers. Actually, I later found out that de Kooning did exactly the same thing.
Oh, really?
Anyway, I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. That's a new version of the idea of painting in ground. I mean, it's actually the ground.
Yeah.
So if you take that literally, where do you go with that? Yeah. So in this case, what you have is transformations. You start in the back right corner of this image, and the newspaper is all lined up, and in the center is a rectangle sprayed with blue paint. Why blue? Because it seemed like a natural color to go on the floor, like water or something. Then that configuration is taken apart you move forward and the papers are just scattered around. So you have the same area of paper,
Yeah.
the same area of paint, but now it's been reconformed, or actually deconformed.
That's interesting. I mean,
And now
there's still a kind of, oh, go ahead.
the paper is, not lined up. The rectangle is sprayed. You take those pieces of paper, take them to the back quadrant, and you line them all up, and then you make the other one. So
Yeah.
the paper coheres, the image disperses, the paper coheres. So it's just a logical series of relationships that yield this object, environment, painting.
Yeah, it's really incredible, the sort of thinking about logics of coherence, right, and logics of dispersion. You're doing other experiments at this moment in Italy, in your shows in Italy, where you're first using the string compass, right, to make some of these degree drawings. This is your installation at left at the Galleria Sperone in Turin in 1970, a gallery then best known for showcasing especially artists associated with arte povera, contemporary Italian artists, as well as American pop artists, among other figures. It was really a major vanguard gallery, alongside other galleries in Turin, like the Gallery Christian Stein, that were sort of internationalizing some of the artistic context there. How do you think about this work, perhaps in relationships to processes of measuring and also relationships between forms in the space?
Well, what you have here is a full circle, a quarter circle, and a half circle, and either the radius or the diameter is taken from the height of the wall. And it creates a kind of I don't know, space, a mental space, physical space, conceptual space, but it's a self-evident thing because, everybody knows how to, draw a circle with a string. And, I was very interested in that time in what I called the mystery of the self-evident. There are a lot of things in the work that are self-evident, but that's what makes them so mysterious. Like, why is it interesting that a straight line is 180 degrees? It's kind of mysterious. So those were things that I was interested in at that point. And it's when I was doing this show that I met Boetti and Salvo and Primi and Pannoni, the artists of arte povera.
Yeah, and I remember in a certain interview you gave, you were speaking about encountering Cunellis's work for the first time, his horses in the subterranean parking garage for Contemporanea, and I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about some of these works in relationship to your encounters with these artists who are experimenting with process and also with systems, thinking of Boetti in particular. This is a catalog, a sort of artist book you did for Franco Toselli. The editor Toselli published it in 1970, at this early moment. And it includes a number of photographs of the works that you did in Italy. Could you tell us more about them, especially some of the private collection works? Those we don't always see as often, and they're really, really kind of interesting interventions in these spaces in Italy.
Well, what I found is there was interest in my work and ideas in Italy that didn't exist in the United States at that time. There was also in Italy, I would say something like you could call a tradition of the new. That the Italians welcomed new ideas. Maybe it goes back to futurism. I don't know. People were interested in things that they hadn't seen before. Whereas in the States, people were interested in things that they had seen before, or so it seemed. I mean, a few years later, that all changed too. So, like the photo in the upper left is the piece that I did for collector in Bari, Angelo Baldassari. He was a very big collector at that time, and people would invite you to their house and they would say, well, do something here.
Yeah.
That was a pretty heady experience. And even the exhibitions that I was having then, you know, it made sense in a way that if European galleries wanted to show American art and they wanted to show like minimalism or, you know, formalist painting, they had to spend a lot of money building crates and shipping.
Yeah.
Whereas if they invited someone like myself, it just was a ticket, a cheap airplane ticket, and you know, stay in a pensione, and you would arrive like Sunday night. The gallery would be empty on Monday, and they would say, "Well, do something." And it was a very kind of existential thrill to not know exactly what you were going to do. I mean, I would have a general concept in mind. And here you have this space and you have this 1 week, and you would try to come up with something that was, you know, interesting, startling, surprising, fresh. And then the opening would be on Friday, and people would be coming up and shaking your hand. Oh, thank you. That's wonderful. And you hadn't even had a chance to see it yourself. It was a very unique set of opportunities. This is a case of a collector in Torino, a very great collector.
Yeah, done in a factory space, right? An abandoned factory space, which is sort of interesting.
Yeah, his family had manufactured nuts and bolts or something for what's its name, the car company.
Oh, for Fiat.
Fiat. They had gone out of business or moved or I don't know what, and now they had this abandoned factory. And he thought, well, I could have artists do artworks in here. So I found this like 25-foot log. What it was doing there, I have no idea. And some junk that I piled up and tilted it, and then I measured the slope. So it was completely improvised on the spot. I mean, I had been thinking about some of these ideas. I'd made sketches of them, but now I was given the opportunity to do them, and I took it.
Yeah, it seems like in a really generative and exciting time, you know, to be given the chance to do something so quickly, and reminds me of some of the things you've written about in terms of, you know, doing art instead of making art. Here you are at the American Academy in Rome. Later, when your partner is at the American Academy and a Rome Prize, you show in Rome, you have experiences there. Certainly you've been in different contexts in Italy, and I wanted to bring in this part of the exhibition to look at a little bit more closely. It really highlights some of the exploration of language that sort of intersects between your practice, Fontana's, and Boetti's. At one point you said that the blah, blah, blah is the black hole of language. How does that relate to some of the experiments in language we see here, thinking about language as a system? And these are very different works, but certainly share an interest in language as form and language as system.
You know, I think the word I use is resonance, because it's like a vibration. I can't specify it. I mean, I felt that with Boetti, we had a lot of similar interests coming from very different kinds of backgrounds. In America, practically every artist of my generation was formed through abstract expressionism. But abstract expressionism as such didn't really exist in Italy. So for me, the turn to language and concept and number and that seemed to grow out of seeds that were planted in abstract expressionism. Whereas with Boetti, there is no abstract expressionism. His work comes from a totally different kind of background. I would think maybe a lot from futurism.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I might think there is sort of the informale in Italy, but it is aligned with different concerns than some of what we see in abstract expressionism, and more aligned with ideas of existential angst and drama that many artists in the 60s, Boetti, Pistoletto, artists would be interested in sort of getting away from and finding a solution out of. So it does seem this experimentation with language certainly connects to futurism. And I think with regard to this work from Fontana, we can also think about the idea of new technology and this interest in space. So we go to spatialism. How do you think that this work sort of operates relative to that gesture, if we're thinking about painting, right? In this work, in the film that Domenico Palma did for Magazzino, we see you kind of speak a little bit about how there are these very direct punctures into it.
The Fontana was an amazing discovery. I don't know if he did any other painting. It's actually a work on paper that he then mounted on canvas that he then stabbed. And I don't think of Fontana as having a sense of irony. I mean, it was one thing that I really responded to in Boetti's work.
Yeah.
Was, he's very witty. It is filled with puns and, you know, double meanings and, contra Frank Stella, what you see is not what you get, or what you get is what you see.
Right.
Whereas Fontana, what you see is what you get. Except for this work, which says basically, I am a saint, but then there's a little thing that says, no, I'm not a saint.
Yeah.
And then the aggression. Now, when Nancy was interviewing me, we were talking about the cuts in Fontana. They're not violent. They're quite controlled.
Yeah.
They're quite conceptualized, actually. Whereas in this little piece, which is very early, supposedly one of the first things he did, although he had done all the ceramics that he cut and punctured and stabbed. This one is extremely aggressive, and it's very mysterious. And obviously, there's a sense of irony and play in it that you don't find in a lot of other Fontanas.
Yeah, there's that sort of self-questioning or self-contradiction that reminds me a little bit of some of your more recent paintings, where you have contradicted yourself across a diptych, for example. So it's really interesting to think about irony in Fontana. As you said, we don't really think of Fontana as being a sort of ironic figure. So it's wonderful to hear a little bit more about how violence might fit into some of that too.
My idea about irony, it was another place where I felt, again, some resonance with Boetti. To me, irony means that there's a meaning inside the meaning that you have to discover. And I don't feel that with Fontana necessarily. And
So how do you think then about irony or humor in some of your work? I want to ask you specifically to kind of conclude the conversation before we open it up to questions. There are two works in the show that engage thinking about Jewishness and about Jewish history and Judaism. You've done many works that explore, one work in particular explored the joys of Yiddish. Obviously had major exhibitions at the Jewish Museum, and this wonderful work is in the show, Complain, and we see kvetch right at the top. But in contrast to the other work in the show, Yizkor for the Jews of Rome, a very somber homage and reflection, memorial really, to the Jews of Rome who lost their lives during the Holocaust and during German occupation. How do you think about these explorations of Judaism and of Jewish history in part in the show?
well, that's who I am. I mean, I don't find it so strange. I was brought up in two languages. And I think when you are brought up in two languages, you're very much more aware. And maybe I was actually brought up in three languages because my parents spoke Yiddish. I went to Hebrew school to learn my bar mitzvah. And I went to English class, American school.
Yeah.
So that's when you see that everything is basically a translation, and there's a lot lost in translation. One of the things that's lost in translation is humor. It's very hard to translate a joke. Very hard to really get to the depth of meaning of certain cultural formations. And some of these things, as you get older, you give yourself more permission to explore and to try to come to terms with. The first version of The Joys of Yiddish was done for a museum in Chicago, the Spertus Institute, which is a Jewish museum. And they were redoing the facade of their building, and they had a big wooden barricade in front. And the curator thought of the idea of inviting some artists to do works on this barricade, which is almost across the street from the Art Institute of Chicago on Michigan Avenue, which is the main street.
Okay. Yeah.
And she called the exhibition The Language Barrier. So for me, the language barrier was Yiddish. I mean, trying to understand what my parents were talking about when they were talking about me, not behind my back, but in my face. And so I designed this thing in anglicized Yiddish words, which are words that have, entered the language, like kvetch or bagel or, any other Yiddish isms. And, I submitted to them, and they were very hesitant. They said, oh, some of these words aren't so nice, and we don't know if we want to put he's up 80 feet high on Michigan, on Michigan Avenue, and can you change this? I said, no, you can't change a work of art. This is it. Take it or leave it. I said, you have to see that it's funny. It's very funny. So on that note, yeah, okay, yeah, I guess it's funny, because nobody likes to be left out of the joke. And so they said, oh, yes, we see it's funny. So they gave it to their production crew, a very nice guy who was an artist. And he calls me and he says, are these really the colors that you want to use, yellow on black? And I said, yeah. And he said, don't you know what that symbolizes? I said, I know what it symbolizes. He said, those are the colors of the stars on the bands that the Nazis made the Jews wear, yellow stars on black bands.
Yeah.
He said, when I tell the curators about this, I don't think they're going to want to do this. And I said, look, let's keep it between you and me. Don't tell the curators. Themselves, that's their problem. But if you don't do it in yellow and black, you don't do it.
Yeah.
And then,
I think that's a kind of fantastic note to start concluding with, but I want to hear your subsequent point. You said, and then.
Well, yeah, at the opening, the director of the Jewish Museum in Vienna just happened to be there. She came to the opening and she came up to me and said, oh, I think your work is really beautiful. It's fantastic, blah, blah, blah. But there's no way I could show this in Vienna. I said, why? I mean, if you can show it in Chicago, you can't show it in Vienna? No. She said, because you see, the right wing would go crazy if they saw this in Vienna. And then the left wing would go crazy too. I said, so you mean it would equally offend both the left and the right? She said, yes. I said, well, that's the reason for doing it.
Absolutely.
But she didn't do it. And
oh, that's too bad. That's too bad. Well, I think what's been so great to see the response to this show at Magazzino is that, of course, there were people who, in the United States, in New York, internationally, who know your work, and but have likely not thought about your work in relationship to Italian art. And thank you and thanks to Magazzino for doing this incredible show. I think that's really made us rethink a lot of the sort of resonances between practices in different places and exchanges between American and Italian art, and I don't know, from the South American avant-gardes as well. It's just an extraordinary show, and huge congratulations. At this point, I want to open it up to some questions. Let me, because I'm sharing my screen, Carolina, if you can forward me the questions, that would be, I think, best. Let's see, I'm not hearing from Carolina, so maybe I should go to the Vimeo page myself. Okay, I'm getting the question. We have one question being relayed. Okay, the question is there any reason that you like to use velvet, especially when we look at this work?
well, the way that happened was somebody sent me a book of a show that was at the National Gallery of Incunabula, which is printing before the invention of the printing press. And one of the things that they were doing in the 12th and 13th century, most of it was on paper, but they did these woodcut images of Veronica's veil with like an image of Christ's face, and they printed them on cloth, and then they sold them as, you know, the original print of Christ's face on Veronica's veil. And when I saw those, I thought, that's a really interesting idea to print on cloth. So we tried to print on canvas, on, you know, various other materials, synthetic materials, natural materials, and the paint wouldn't stay on the surface. It all sunk in unless you put a ground on it. If you put a ground on it, then it wasn't a piece of cloth. And at the last minute, David Lasry, who's the head of Two Palms Press, said, I have this piece of black velvet. You know how photographers put a piece of black velvet over their head? Said, I have this piece of black velvet that I use when I photograph things. Let's try that. Said, okay, you know, whatever. And it was amazing. The paint stayed on the surface because it's so tightly woven. And I immediately loved it because it also brought up all of these unanticipated kitsch references to, you know, the famous Elvis is in the building paintings, references Elvis Presley. And the fact that it was very hard to control how it would take the paint. As you can see here in this painting, this splotch of basically uncontrolled paint, unanticipated behavior. So it just seemed to me like a perfect material to use. And then when I found out that Fontana had painted on velvet too, and we found this Fontana on velvet, it just seemed to close the circle of the exhibition.
Yeah, it's really an extraordinary Fontana in the show. And I love that thinking, though, in the American context about the connection to kitsch, right? Which it immediately calls to mind. There's so much sort of rich humor in the work. We have another question. How did you support yourself during these years? I presume they mean your early years. Did you have teaching or freelance projects?
Well, the one-word answer is barely. But yes, I did teach. Yeah. I taught at the School of Visual Art until I think 1972.
The next question is asking, why is your text in Roman capitals and not in script, for example, like Fontana? I think to add on to that, we could ask about, if we come back to this, for example. Certainly there's an interest in typography and in lettering in your work. Why are you so interested in Roman capitals as a use of type?
Well, just because they're so blunt. I mean, I've done works in all kinds of typography. I've done works in script, hand printing, but I like the bluntness of this particular letter, which does not come out of a typography book. I designed, you know, an alphabet, and
so that's interesting that you spend time to design an alphabet.
Yeah, it's just there. And so I don't have to think about it. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to have any design considerations.
That's interesting, though, given that you did design this alphabet, right, in order to get that visual effect of being so blunt.
I designed it because that's the way I form letters.
Yeah.
I guess everybody thinks it's a big deal that my father was a sign painter, and maybe it is a big deal. But when I was a kid, I had to apprentice to him, and I hated every minute of it. But I learned how to form letters, and I learned probably the biggest lesson, which is how to work.
Yeah.
It's not always inspiration. It's more perspiration and desperation than inspiration.
Yeah, I think that gives new insight into, your working drawings and your hypotheses and theories for things. So much of the language on the one hand seems to come from the space of linguistic, mathematical theory, philosophy, but also at the same time there is that thought process about working through, right, a method and using something to do work and to think things through, which is something that you said once that struck me about, thinking about using art as a way to think through things. Certainly with quite a bit of work across the trajectory of your career. We have another question. When thinking of your word portraits and translation, is there an element of translation from physical form to written language?
Well, that's a really that's a really good question. As I said, everything is a kind of translation, from the mental to the physical to the visual, to trying to find the right form, the right, what I call, delivery system. When they send a rocket to the moon, the rocket is the delivery system, and the thing on top is the, what do they call it? The package, so to speak.
Yeah.
So to get the lift off, to get you to the meaning, you have to have a form. I mean, that was always my discipline in conceptual art. I'm really interested in having something to look at. I want to engage a single viewer one at a time in a process of looking at something, which hopefully will make you think about something. And that's also one of the advantages of language. When you see a painting that has words, 9 out of 10 people stop and read the words. Whether they're particularly interested in it or not, if you see words, you stop and you read it.
Yeah.
Then, there are different kinds of words, there are different kinds of statements. And to me, it's a conduit into a person's mind. It's a conduit.
That's a really thought-provoking question and response. 2 other questions. I'm going to ask first the one that deals more with translation. You mentioned that humor is lost in translation. Could there be a solution with an in-depth translation, or do you think that humor is too attached to our cultures and societies we form these ideas in?
Well, I'll tell you a story. I had a show in France about 10 years ago, where we showed a group of the thesaurus paintings, which are like plain, kvetch, bitch, mo, etc.
Yeah.
And the curator thought it would be a very good idea, because it was in a very provincial place, if we had a translation of some of the paintings. So he called the local university, and they sent a couple of students over, and they started out trying to translate the words for the painting Crazy. So it was crazy, foo, loco, foo. Out
Yeah.
of your mind, foo. Yeah, foo. So the whole page is that foo, 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 foo. The thing is that English is a very rich language because it takes in other languages, whereas French is language of purity, and they spend hundreds of years deciding which words go in the dictionary and which words don't. And if you use an Americanism on a sign in Paris, there was a famous restaurant called Le Hamburger, they were fined. And they could not use the word hamburger because it was an Americanism. So yes, translation is a complicated, very complicated issue, and a lot is lost.
This is great. We have another interesting question with regard to thinking about both your role as an artist curator and also your current show at Krakow Witkin Gallery. And the first is, could you speak to your role as an artist curator? I'm wondering how your conception of this role has changed over the course of your career. We talked a little bit about that in the beginning, but maybe you have a different view of it than you did early on.
Well, in neither case did I start out wanting to be a curator. I think I spoke about the School of Visual Arts show. This show, I met Nancy and Michael, and I had a show at David Toda Gallery with Boetti. They had seen it. They found it interesting. I think they were trying to expand the horizon of Magazzino and were wondering if we could do something similar. And I said, yeah, that would be great, but why not just expand the horizon a little bit and include Fontana because of my interest in his work and because of my use of glass. And they thought that was a very good idea. So I thought, okay, now you can do it. And they said, well, we'd like you to curate it. And at first I resisted. Oh, I'm not really a curator. No, you should really curate it. Okay, why not? And then began the hard work of being a curator, because you might have an idea for something, but you can't always get the thing that you want. It was very hard to find Fontanas, for example. Most of my works in this show come from my collection. Most of the Boettis come from the Magazzino collection. One of the Fontanas comes from Magazzino. The rest of them were literally like pulling teeth, and especially during COVID, a lot of Italian collectors that owned, I think they're called barocchis with the little pieces of glass on them. They didn't want art handlers coming into their house and wrapping a painting, and I completely understood it. Eventually, we were able to get these things, but I never thought of myself as a curator as such. I was just, putting things together that I thought would be interesting to think about.
I think that's a kind of brilliant point to end with. So much of your practice thinks about doing and about activities and interventions. And something you said to me as we prepared for this conversation was, well, you never really wanted to do the same thing the same way again. And I think what we found in this exhibition at Magazzino is a completely different point of entry into your work and to the resonances and revelations you've highlighted through your discussion of your Italian days and through your attention to the work of Fontana and Boetti. So I thank you sincerely. Many, many thanks also to Magazzino for supporting programming for this exhibition, of course, for the invitation to moderate and host this. Do you have any final thoughts or words to share with us as we conclude the program today.
Well, I had no idea where this was going to go or what it was going to be. It turned out to be really fun and pleasurable and thought-provoking for myself. And I think you can see in the little film that Magazzino did just how much fun it was to install this show. To see the juxtapositions, the surprises, the resonance, which I keep saying, the revelations, the Fontana on velvet. And so it's been a really great experience. And a lot of these works, like the Via Tasso piece with the matchsticks, haven't been shown in 20 or 30 years.
Wow.
So to have the opportunity to do that was a great gift that Magazzino gave to me.
Yeah. I encourage everybody to go see the show if possible. Magazzino has wonderful technology to make sure that you have a safe in-person experience, as well as limited audiences so that you can experience the space safely, view the exhibition in person. If you're not able to travel or to get to New York, you can, of course, visit the exhibition's digital tour. There's a wonderful interactive digital tour that you can see online on Magazzino's website. You can also look through their other materials available online in relationship to the exhibition, and there will be a catalog that's forthcoming as well, which will be made available online with contributions from Bruno Corra and Laura Cherubini and Jeffrey Young, and also a statement from Mel. So with that, many thanks, Mel. Grazie di cuore, to use the Italian. And I hope everybody has a chance to see the show. It closes April 5th as its last day.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao a tutti.